Welcome back to the second session of the day. The title is Security Under Anarchy. I'm not quite sure why, but nevertheless that's the title. We're reversing the order of presenters. Cornelia is going first, and she tells me that the title of her paper is now Unipolarity, Hegemony and Counterpower, Changing Continuity in International Politics, Hacking, Cycling, gone. And Nick is not talking about the stag hunt. He is now talking about Waltz's nuclear world or beyond it, and the idea that more trust may be better. The one instruction I have is that we have to end at 12:30 and no later, because we only have 3/4 of an hour for lunch. So we will, I'll ask them to speak for the usual 20 minutes and then take some questions, but we have to be out of here at 12:30. So Cornelia, would you like to Cornelia, by the way, who is, I think has this extremely challenging task of writing a biography of Kenneth Waltz, and she tells me that she's begun it, and she hasn't yet decided whether this conference itself will form part of the biography. Anyway, it's something for us to ponder a bit as to, and I'll be a little bit cautious perhaps. Anyway, Cornelia.
That is not supposed to be a remark about the quality of the conference. Okay, thank you very much for being able to be here and speak here today. I'm going to speak about unipolarity, hegemony, and counterpower. I think for a symposium on Kenneth Waltz, obviously it makes sense to reflect on his seminal theory as well as current writing and trying to apply it to the world we live in today. And I will do that. I will take up what I regard as his most important claims, which I think to be the importance of material facts and a general tendency towards equilibrium. And I will explain why these are still important in understanding the world we live in today, marked by unipolarity, international terrorism, and the emergence of possible new challenges. Furthermore, I think we have to integrate this approach, and we have to integrate it with much more accumulated theory than was present when Waltz wrote the theory, in order to argue that first of all, of course, material facts are still important in understanding continuity in international relations, and secondly, we have to complement this understanding by accepting ideas as a force for change, possibly also for continuity, but importantly a force for change. So I argue essentially for a synthetic approach which takes in more perspectives than just realism without forgetting about realism's wisdom. Let me say first a word about unipolarity and hegemony. Structural realism, obviously, as influenced by economic science, takes a distinctively materialist view on human affairs and therefore international relations. Waltz argued that the international system structure is defined by the number and constellation of dominating powers. Domination is based on the command of superior power resources, i.e. capabilities, which are referred to in factors such as size of population and territory, resource endowment, economic capability, military strength, and so forth. Ideological factors are explicitly excluded, such as ideology, propensity to peace, aggressiveness, and so forth. These material capabilities then are measured relationally, and in order to establish poles of power which are counted in order to make up for the configuration of the system. If you take up this materialist view, obviously we come to a description of the international system today as marked by unipolarity, I would say. In terms of economic power, in terms of military power, the United States are still the strongest power in international relations. We could argue, obviously, that, like Mersheimer and Hamilton do, that we have multipolarity, looking at the economic growth and strength of China, looking at the military power of Russia, for example. However, both would say that the United States are still the strongest power. However, I would argue that we have to integrate, or we have to combine this materialist view with, say, a constructivist perspective by arguing that not only material factors are important in understanding the dominant position of the United States, but also ideational factors, matter being a force for continuity and stability in human affairs, and ideas being a force rather for change. And if you combine these two perspectives, we come to the discussion about hegemony of the United States, meaning that the United States power is based on such things as soft power, discourse, ideology, and so forth. And indeed, if you combine these two perspectives, the materialist and the ideationalist perspectives, we come to the dominant position of the United States in a more multifaceted, multidimensional view. And the United States then are the dominant power in terms of its economy, armament, policy, discourse, and ideology combined. The United States hegemony rests on material factors and foundations, but is created and maintained by the promotion of ideas and policies. Secondly, I would like to say a word about structural realism and the search for equilibrium. Unipolarity is neither the only possible configuration in international affairs, nor will it be everlasting. It can actually be regarded as an anomaly. And in the long term, as Kenneth Waltz argued, it will lead to the recreation of international politics proper, or the recreation of multipolarity. And principally, I would argue we can detect here a tendency towards equilibrium, which is underlying all the claims that are present in structural realism, namely bipolarity is most stable, asymmetric powers will balance, symmetric powers will also balance, but not if they can bandwagon against a larger one. I would also say that the idea or the tendency towards equilibrium, and I'm not sure if Kenneth Waltz here agrees, is it opens up the room for agency. And equilibrium, I would say, is in itself probably much more an idea than maybe a natural law in itself. So here we would open up space for an ideational factor. However, the tendency to equilibrium is present, and it is a pursued tendency is realized by a presumably universal strategy of competitive, self-regarding, reciprocal behavior, accumulating resources in response to gains in the relevant other. Interestingly, and I have to bring this in order to explain in the last part, international terrorism, interestingly, the same reciprocal logic is underlying rational choice logic of tit for tat, being another reciprocity, not the reciprocity in accumulation of resources, but the reciprocity in behavior. Cooperation is answered with cooperation, defection is answered with defection. So both strategies or both assumptions essentially show a tendency towards equilibrium. One balancing essentially an equilibrium in material factors, whereas rational choice tit for tat an equilibrium in behavior, mutual behavior. Both of these strategies were applied in the Cold War, when we had the bipolar system where balancing took place, as well as tit for tat strategy more or less applied. However, for both of them, the end of the Cold War and the emergence of unipolarity and asymmetry obviously is a problem. For tit for tat obviously is a problem because under asymmetric conditions, tit for tat logic changes itself, and the dominant power, the hegemonic power in an asymmetric situation can exploit the situation and can divert from the tit for tat logic. It can essentially exploit the other side because it doesn't need to fear defection from the weaker side. It can actually bear the costs of defection of the weaker side and can theoretically, therefore, engage in defective behavior. Structural realism would principally assume in an asymmetric situation that we have a tendency towards balancing by aligning with other states or by internal balancing. However, obviously with the end of the Cold War, this balancing was hard to maintain or not anymore possible. So here is where I again would bring in another approach, and I would argue that this situation is to be explained by, for example, coming from the perspective of constructivism. Alex Lamb would argue that in this situation, at the end of the Cold War, the system was, the interaction logic in the system, not only the configuration of the system was transformed into an asymmetric one, but also the interaction logic of the system was transformed into a social one, into another regarding one, in which the weaker powers started and had to accept the dominant power of the United States. And this was only possible and did only work because the United States were thought to engage also in more social behavior, also in more other regarding and altruistic behavior. The same argument is essentially interestingly made by hegemonic stability, which is the realist explanation for this transformation of the system, where one dominant power, the hegemon essentially, takes up a leading role, takes up a promoter role for international order by creating institutions, by implementing norms, and by facilitating socialization. The hegemon thus uses its power to transform the system from a Hobbesian one, where balancing takes place and occurs, into a more Kantian anarchy, into a more socialized system, into a more mature anarchy. And this was happening by, for example, the implementation of new policies, the promotion of new norms, the realization of ideology, and so forth, with all the effects such as globalization, promotion of human rights, democratization, and so forth and so on. The problem, however, in this system was that the idea of equilibrium, which was still present, was not sufficiently realized. And I would say that this lack of realization of equilibrium prompted problems for this asymmetric system. Problems such as the anti-globalization movement, and I would even argue problems such as international terrorism. The reaction of the hegemon in response to this problem resulted in an overstretch of the hegemon, and essentially resulted in the fact that after 2001, the hegemon started to free ride in its own system. The hegemon started to abandon its own system, violate its own norms, and stop cooperating in his own institutions. And this is essentially what happened, particularly with the war in Iraq. And this, of course, is a very dangerous situation, because if you have a socialized system which rests on the institutions that the hegemon has created, as well as on the hegemon itself, if the hegemon then free rides in the system and leaves the system alone, we face the danger that the system might de-erode into the former stages of its constitution. So the problem that we face now with the United States abandoning its created system is that we have still the constitutions, the institutions in the system that maintain the stability of the system and that serve as a force for stability for this socialized system. But the danger is that the whole system might erode back, at least partially, into power politics. I mean, we do see indicators for that indeed, for example, in the conflict with Russia, for example, in an alliance between Russia, India, and China, which is supposed to create a counterpole to the United States, and so forth and so on. And I would argue the only solution to this problem of erosion of the system that we had is for the hegemon to cooperate again in his own system, support its own system, and for generally to fulfill the need for the tendency towards equilibrium. And I would argue finally that we have to maintain the system, we have to go forward in the system of integration in order to have a system where we have international peace, not necessarily international peace, but international peace. And I do regard the erosion of the system into traditional power politics as the most dangerous thing possible. Let me say a word about international terrorism, and here again I will refer to realist assumptions. Kenneth Waltz, in his chapter Continuity in International Politics, argued terrorism does not change the imbalance of world power, and it might even aggravate its effects. Both elements of this proposition could empirically be observed in the aftermath of 9/11. I would, however, argue that terrorism is a symptom rather than a peripheral occurrence of this imbalance of international affairs. Obviously, if you look at the Middle East, from the structural realist view, Middle East being a rather weak power economically, militarily, with declining per capita income, and a semi-peripheral region, the Middle East theoretically should start to balance the United States. It should, for example, theoretically align with China against the United States. However, this, apart from the cases such as Iran and Syria, does not happen. The Middle East is very much aligned with the United States and trending towards the United States. Opposition remains on a rather tentative level. And I would argue here again we find the influence of ideas and ideology, meaning that, for example, Galton had explained that the hegemon spreads his hegemony on declined elites in a semi-peripheral region to implement or exert control. However, this hegemony, which serves for abandoning balancing logic, does not spread or does not go as deep as to the populations in the Middle East. So in the populations in the Middle East, the perception of the need for equilibrium and the tendency towards equilibrium is still there. And this is empirically realized in a certain frustration with the relative deprivation, in a certain frustration also principally with the dominant power of the United States and the foreign policy of the United States. And I would argue this frustration or the lack of balancing on the higher level essentially, so the lack of balancing on the higher level, which indicates that the need for equilibrium is not fulfilled, or the tendency towards equilibrium is not fulfilled, results in the end in international terrorism, which is an expression of the tendency towards equilibrium from the sub-state level, whereas balancing is missing on the unit level. If you look at international terrorism, indeed, the agents of international terrorism argue that their motivation for engaging in violent action is indeed economic reasons and the experience of violence and so forth and so on. Ideological factors also are mentioned, but they're not the only factors. It is not only about religion. So, in conclusion, I would say terrorists are a substitute for balancing at the unit level, where at the unit level balancing does not take place, and it's realized in applying violence in a tit-for-tat fashion, in responding, and this could be empirically shown, in responding to the experience of violence with applying a strategy of terrorism in a tit-for-tat fashion. So in the end, I would like to argue we cannot forget about realism's wisdom in explaining current processes and phenomena and the current international world. We still have to regard material factors, and we have to remember the tendency to equilibrium, but we have to combine it with other perspectives, and we have to combine it with a perspective which acknowledges the importance of ideas as well, and therefore I argue for a synthetic approach. Thank you very much.
I'd like to begin by thanking Ken Booth for conceiving and organising such a wonderful gathering in honour of the other Ken's colossal contribution over a lifetime to this field of international relations that we're all privileged to be part of. It's a delight to see Ken back in Aberystwyth, a place which he first visited in the early 90s. But I'd like to just share with you for a moment my first experience of meeting Ken. It was the Beyer Conference in Reading in 1986, and my paper, aptly given the title of this panel, was entitled Anarchy and Security, and it was my first outing with the security dilemma. I remember as a nervous 24-year-old describing Ken's views about the security dilemma with him sitting in the front row there in front of me. Suffice to say, I was very apprehensive when he walked into the room at the conference. But as I went through my paper, Ken sent me from time to time reassuring nods, although there was the occasional shaking of the head. But I was very grateful for that. And at the end of the session, he came up to me and we chatted. And he then generously invited me to come up to London and to meet with him and to carry on the conversation. You can imagine this was a wonderful opportunity for a young research student, and I appreciate to this day, Ken, the kindness and encouragement that you showed me. My brief for this conference is the nuclear issue, and my inevitable starting point is Waltz's 1981 Adelphi paper, The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, More May Be Better. This is a tour de force which anyone writing about the question of nuclear proliferation cannot but engage with. And it remains, in my view, as unsettling and challenging an argument as it was when it was first published over 25 years ago. Now, of course, in his Adelphi paper, Waltz challenged the conventional wisdom head-on, arguing that nuclear proliferation was not the dangerous prospect that everybody else in the Non-Proliferation Treaty was arguing it, of course, to be, and that instead, indeed, more may be better. Now, I reject this Waltzian argument on the grounds, in part, as Nita and Ned were arguing yesterday, that we cannot build order on the basis of nuclear fear. Instead, again, echoing Nita's remarks from yesterday, I want to argue that we should explore the possibilities for building trust rather than fear between nuclear-armed and arming states. Now, the starting point for this inquiry is that the concept of trust has been marginalized in the field of international relations. And I would argue that this neglect of trust has had negative consequences for exploring viable alternatives to a nuclear-armed world. For the most part, the mainstream has conceded the view that because of the inescapable uncertainties that confront governments about the motives and intentions of others, the security dilemma, it is dangerous to trust in the peaceful intentions of other states that have the capabilities to inflict great harm, if that trust should prove misplaced. Thus, as John Mearsheimer has argued, there's no room for trust in a world of states. Now, without underestimating the force of this position, the paper argues that trust only flourishes under conditions of uncertainty, and that the challenge is to open up space for trust, which is potentially available in many situations. And a key contribution here is the theory and practice of security communities, which we all talked about yesterday. And I would argue that a good illustration of the possibilities of nuclear trust building is the security community that developed between Brazil and Argentina in the 1980s. I think this is really interesting because both those states were developing programs, nuclear programs, that could have led to nuclear weapons. And I think it's an interesting case for how two states were able to put their nuclear rivalry back in the box and to actually move towards the development of a security community. Let me start then by briefly running through Waltz's arguments about nuclear weapons before the Adelphi paper, then explore a little bit the nature of Waltz's nuclear world and offer a critique of it, before exploring some ideas about trust building under anarchy. Waltz had argued in Man, the State and War, as we heard from David this morning, that wars occur in anarchy because there's nothing to prevent them. And his only solution to the problem of international anarchy was world government, which he dismissed as utopian. At the same time, though, he rejected the view that nuclear weapons had revolutionized warfare, as deterrence theory argued. But his earlier views on the virtual irrelevance of nuclear weapons to international politics had undergone a fundamental shift by the 1980s, such that he'd now become convinced that nuclear weapons had so transformed the propensities of states to wage war that, quote, although the possibility of war remains, nuclear weapons have drastically reduced the probability of its being fought by the states that have them, end quote. What is more, as I said, once converted to deterrence theory, Waltz pressed its case in a direction that even its most vigorous supporters had been wary of advancing, namely the thesis that the benefits of nuclear deterrence should be spread to other states by proliferating nuclear weapons. Waltz based his controversial conclusion that the, quote, measured spread of nuclear weapons is more to be welcomed than feared, end quote, on his assessment of the effects that nuclear weapons had in promoting cautious superpower behavior during the Cold War. Compared to his earlier discussions in Man, the State and War and Theory of International Politics, he was now so impressed with the war-preventing character of nuclear weapons that he argued that all that was necessary for deterrence was a secure second strike capability. Comparing the challenge of deterrence in a pre-nuclear world with that of a nuclear one, he wrote, quote, In a conventional world, one is uncertain about winning or losing. In a nuclear world, one is uncertain about surviving or being annihilated." End quote. Waltz's proliferation optimism, as against John's contention yesterday about his assumptions in theory of international politics, rests on the rational actor assumption that all leaders, irrespective of the character and values of the state in question, will rationally decide to avoid war, including conventional war, when faced with the risk of nuclear devastation. As Nita pointed out yesterday, Waltz has accepted that, and this is Waltz now, for convenience, he can be assumed to be relying on an assumption of rationality. However, I think this is very important. He's reminded his readers elsewhere, as he did here with his intervention yesterday afternoon, that nuclear weapons have created a huge awareness on the part of all decision makers that any use of nuclear weapons would lead to frightening costs. Indeed, he argued in his 2003 book with Scott Sagan, in the debate that they have in that excellent book, that what was beneath rationality was ultimately fear. And he wrote, and I think this is a really interesting, sums up your position, I think, really well in terms of the relationship between rationality and what really lies beneath it. He wrote, "Deterrence does not depend on rationality, it depends on fear. To create fear, nuclear weapons are the best possible means." Waltz had previously argued that world government was the only solution to the violent conflicts generated by an anarchic system. But his analysis of the nuclear issue had led him, as Campbell Craig and others have argued, to identify a trumping causal factor, fear, that could reduce the risks of war between nuclear-armed states to nearly zero. Now, the difficulty in accepting that more may be better is that there might be 99% confidence that nuclear deterrence would hold war at bay between states possessing nuclear weapons, and in so doing prevent conventional wars between those powers that might otherwise have occurred. There might be that 99% confidence that we can have in nuclear deterrence lasting. But if the price of this is living with a 1% uncertainty that deterrent rationality might one day fail, and the time frame here is one of centuries and not decades, for as long as we live in an international anarchy, is this a price worth paying given the terrible consequences of any nuclear wars that do occur? I leave that hanging. Is there an alternative then to Waltz's nuclear world in which the prevention of major war rests on the existence into perpetuity of nuclear arsenals? Well, in the paper I look at one alternative, nuclear future, that rejects both a global state and a proliferating nuclear world. And that's Jonathan Schell's imaginative proposal in his 1984 book, The Abolition, of achieving nuclear disarmament through the idea of weaponless deterrence. And I go into the Schell argument in the paper. I don't have time here to do that, but I argue that it's ultimately equally problematic because it relies even more than Waltz's does on the fear of nuclear war. And so in the last section of the paper, I try to explore whether there might be a viable alternative to relying on fear as the basis of our security in a nuclearizing world, and look at the possibility of trust. And the promise of trust building at the international level is the promise of security communities. The latter are characterized by a high degree of integration. As in the EU, the use of force has been delegitimized, and no military plans are made against the other members of the community, and there are high levels of mutual transparency. And the litmus test of a security community is that the participants do not target each other. I argue in the paper that an important case of nuclear trust building, leading to the development of a security community, was the rapprochement that took place between Brazil and Argentina in the 1980s. As I say, there have been growing concerns that both these states might become nuclear armed, and few were optimistic, contra Waltz's argument, that nuclearizing this regional rivalry would have positive consequences for security in South America. And the paper identifies 3 factors that seem to have been decisive in building trust between Brazil and Argentina. Mutual sensibility to security dilemma dynamics is the first. Recognition that moves to promote trust entail an acceptance of both uncertainty and vulnerability is the second. And the third one is the development of shared values at both the elite and intersocietal levels. How have I got left?
5 or 10 minutes.
Okay, that's great. Let me say a little bit about security dilemma sensibility. A key precondition for developing trust between two antagonists is that decision makers on both sides come to appreciate that others might be acting out of fear and not malevolence. And crucially, that each side recognizes the role that their own actions have played in provoking that fear. Sensitivity on the part of leaders to fear-based hostility, or Robert Jervis had earlier called the spiral model, has been defined by Ken Booth and me as security dilemma sensibility. And coming back to Nita's discussion yesterday, empathy is clearly crucial to the exercise of security dilemma sensibility. There is evidence that the key figures in Argentina and Brazil were not only able to exercise such empathetic responsiveness to each other's security concerns, but also able to use this knowledge to develop policies that signal their mutual trustworthiness. Because it doesn't necessarily follow that the act of empathy will lead to trust-building policies. It might, but then that brings us to the question of whether decision makers can make a leap of trust and can take the moves that might open that up. The second thing that I think was important in this case, and is important in any moves to build trust between antagonists, is that there has to be an acceptance of uncertainty and vulnerability, because these are key properties of trust. However successful initial acts of trust may be in initiating a process of trust building, an element of uncertainty about the motives and intentions of others will always remain in the relationship. To trust to any degree, then, is always to risk betrayal, which is why, of course, the realists tell us that we have to always assume the worst. But the corollary of this, accepting this risk of betrayal, is that, of course, we can only build trust if we're willing to accept vulnerability to that betrayal, even though we don't think that is going to happen. But if it does happen, then, of course, we face consequences. In the case of Argentina and Brazil, the Presidents Alfonsín and Sarney would have been unusually trusting in the mid-80s, when they pledged that their nuclear programs were only for peaceful purposes, if they'd not borne in mind the possibility that they could be betrayed by the other. Nonetheless, they pressed on without guarantees that the other party was not feigning trustworthiness as a cover to pursue a covert weapons program. And this, I think, is important, that their acceptance of the uncertainty and the vulnerability didn't stop them moving forward. Third factor is the development of shared values. The transition to democratic rule in both Brazil and Argentina was pivotal in building trust between them, because it brought to power leaders who were aware of the growing costs and risks of pursuing a unilateral approach to security. Positive relationships between leaders spilled over into the intersocietal level. And this, of course, doesn't always happen in relationships of trust. It doesn't always filter down in that way. But Argentina and Brazil became partners across a whole range of political, economic, and military issues, leading Andrew Hull in the mid-1990s to argue that what had developed was a loosely knit security community. Now, I examine in the paper the offensive realist counter-arguments to a security community explanation, and we have one of the leading exponents in the room of that view, so I won't go into that in detail, but let me just say that I reject those arguments for refusing to recognize that identities can change in ways that transcends traditional security competition. I then look at the question of whether the case can be generalized to other regions. I think this is a really fascinating question. And I suggest some of the difficulties of generalizing the case to places like South Asia and the Middle East. But I also argue that there have been moments in those more difficult regions, in the India-Pakistan nuclear relationship and in the Middle East, when leaders have taken a risky leap of trust aimed at breaking down enemy images. And I argue that we ought to spend more time thinking about the possibilities of what kind of leaps of trust might break down enemy relationships between other nuclear and potentially nuclear-armed states. And I argue that ultimately this requires leaders to be prepared to take some risks and costs. So to conclude then, the Brazil-Argentina case, I think, should serve as an important model for achieving nuclear abolition. And the challenge, I think, is to examine the variables that made it possible in that case and see if they can be transplanted into different regional contexts. And this is an ongoing research project that we're doing in the David Davis Memorial Institute of International Studies. There are no risk-free nuclear futures available to us. But when decision makers in nuclear armed states weigh the costs of taking a leap of trust that might prove costly and dangerous, they need to remember that misplaced suspicion brings with it its own set of costs and risks. To give way to the impulse to mistrust risks if hostility is fear-based, and of course there can be no guarantees here, that's the importance of the security dilemma. But if it is fear-based, then states risk becoming trapped in spiraling distrust that could have been avoided. And this, of course, increases the risks that crises might end in the use of nuclear weapons across the decades and centuries to come. There is certainly no ground for complacency that security dilemma dynamics will not lead to nuclear war. And plenty of historical evidence from both the Cold War, as we were discussing yesterday in relation to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think in relation to South Asia, although I know Ken has a different interpretation of that, to suggest that we underestimate these dangers at our peril. If we're serious about ridding the world of nuclear threats, then the only realistic path is to substitute them with robust security communities built on relations of trust. Thank you.